Ever stood under a sky so wide your secrets felt small? We ride the stories of the West, campfire, truce, trail, dust, memories, saloon whispers, gritty human, sometimes messy. Every tale is a horizon to chase. Subscribe, pull up a stool, and maybe find a little courage for your own frontier. The first sound was the splash. Cold water leapt from the horse trough and broke across her face. She gripped the rough plank with both hands, knuckles scraped raw. Mud streaked her cheeks. Blood had dried at her hairline in a thin, rusted lace. Flies worried the edges of the wounds and kept coming back. Jonah Reed stood behind her, with a dented bucket caught on his fingers. His shirt clung to his back. Sunlight hammered the yard hard and white. The smell of old hay and wet iron rose from the trough. He tipped the bucket again. Water slid over her shoulders and pooled in the hollow of her collarbone. She flinched but did not pull away. Her dress was torn at the hip and the knee. One shoe was gone. A pale scar shaped like a crescent showed below her left ear when her hair slipped. She blinked up at him and tried to speak. What came out was a rasp. He set the bucket down. He used a clean rag. He dragged the cloth across her brow, then her jaw, then the cut on the bridge of her nose. He touched lightly, like the boards under his feet might crack if he pressed too hard. "You with me?" he asked. She nodded once. The nod looked like it cost her more than it should. "Name," he said. Her mouth twitched. No sound. "Cup first," he said. He dipped a tin cup and held it to her lips. She stiffened. Steam was not on the water. The heat was in the noon air and in his hand. She took a sip, then another, then lifted her own hand to steady the cup. The muscles in her forearm trembled, then steadied. She let out a thin breath that sounded like a wire unwinding. "June," she said finally, the word barely lifted from her throat. "June," he repeated. He looked past her to the fence line where he had found her at sunrise. The wire there sagged. Something had been dragged through the dust and grass. The path cut straight toward the trough, and then stopped in broken footprints dotted with blood. The wind shifted. It carried the dry bite of sage and the sour of horse sweat. In the doorway of the barn, an old wind chime made from bent horseshoes clicked once against itself. The sound was small. It still reached him. He wiped the cloth in the bucket, wrung it tight, dabbed again. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. It was not a prayer. It kept his hands slow. "Inside," he said. She let him lift her. She hooked an arm around his neck without thinking about it. Her weight came in jolts like a bird caught in wire. He carried her into the house and set her on the narrow cot by the window. The room smelled like cedar smoke and coffee that had boiled too long. Dust hung in the light. Her chest rose and fell in small, quick rises. He propped her with a folded blanket and filled the small stove. He heated water. He shaved slivers from a bar of brown soap. He cut an old sheet into strips. He worked while she slept with her eyes half open. When he touched her wrist, he saw the marks that cord leaves behind. He did not comment on them. He wrapped her hands first, then the ribs, then the thigh where the dress was torn. She woke to the scrape of the ladle in the pot. Her eyes were green. He noticed it and then pushed the noticing away. "I forgot lunch," he said. The words surprised him. He did not talk to himself most days. She looked at the light in the window, then back at him, then at the pot. "It is still morning to me," she said. He ladled cornmeal thick as paste into a bowl and cut a scrap of salt pork on top. He slid the bowl onto the table by her knees. He waited. The spoon lay beside it. She took the spoon and touched the edge of the bowl. He went back to the stove and watched the blue flame hold steady. Behind him, her spoon clicked once against the tin. The first bite made her eyes water. She kept going. Halfway through, she set the spoon down and pressed the heel of her hand into her stomach. He reached for the bowl. She lifted it away and finished the rest without looking at him. She set the bowl back and let out a breath. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He put the bowl in the wash basin and filled it. Water ran out, carrying the faint grease of pork and the salt-like sweat. He fixed the window latch and tied a strip of cloth around a loose hinge so it would not knock all night. When he turned, she was watching him, the way a stray watches a hand to see if it will open or close. "Why me?" she said. The words were not a question. They hung in the air and then fell. He sat on the chair across from the cot. The chair creaked. He rested his hands on his knees, palms down. "Because you were here," he said. Her face did not move. The skin around her eyes tightened, then eased. Outside, a horse stamped. In the rafters, a wasp kept hitting the wall in the same place over and over. He lit a lamp, even though the light from the window was bright. The habit was that strong. Flame made the room feel held together. He set the lamp low so the glass would not blacken. The hours fell into a line. Morning meant water and cloth. Afternoon meant a small meal and quiet talk if there was any. Night meant heat for the fever and a fresh sheet under her. He kept the count in his head, and with the gourd he used as a ladle. 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, 1 when the sun gave up. On the second afternoon he burned his fingertips when the pot shifted. He bit back a curse and shook his hand. A thin splash of soup hit the floor. He knelt and wiped it before it dried. When he stood, she was smiling in a way that did not reach far but changed her mouth all the same. "You remembered twice," she said. "That is a lot." Her voice had a split in it. He found he wanted to keep it from closing. He went out to the yard before the light went red. He checked each latch on the barn and the gate. He ran his palm along the fence posts where the wire pulled tight. The trough had filled where he had left the pump handle propped. He knocked the handle down and watched the surface settle. A pale circle of sky wobbled on the water like a coin someone had just tossed. He looked up. The moon was still thin. He mentally counted. 4 nights to full. He was not a man who kept calendars on the wall. Silas Boone stepped out of the barn with a saddle blanket over his shoulder. He was a spare man with a beard like gray moss. His knees made a faint crack when he stopped. He nodded at the house and then at the fence where the grass lay flat. "You keeping her here," Silas said. "For now," Jonah said. Silas moved the horseshoes hanging over the barn door so they would not clatter if a breeze came hard. He pretended to be worried about mice. Jonah watched his hands tie the shoes with new twine. "Wind sounds different tonight," Silas said. He rubbed the rim of his chest with a thumb and coughed once. Jonah looked past him over the scrub across the wide wash that ran dry 9 months of the year. Heat was still coming off the ground in a visible blur. No one stood on the ridge. No one moved through the grass. Still a small itch ran behind his ribs. He went back inside with the last of the light. He checked the lamp and the stove. June was sitting with her back against the wall, knees-drawn blanket over them both. Her hair was clean now. It made the bruise on her temple look darker. He poured black coffee from the pot that always sat on the back of the stove. He did not sweeten it. He held the cup to her and waited. She took it in both hands. She took a cautious sip and winced. She swallowed anyway and then took another. The smell of it filled the room. Something in her face loosened. "Safe here," he said. She looked at the door, at the window, at the lamp. "Safe does not last," she said. He did not argue. He put the pot back on the stove. He cleaned the knife with his shirt tail and set it where he could find it in the dark without looking. Night raised itself slow over the mesa. Crickets started up at the fence. The horses stood hip-shot in the corral. The wind found the chime and touched it. The sound drifted in and then died. He dozed in the chair. It took one sound to wake him, her voice. "When the moon rounds out like a dollar," she said, not looking at him, "they come." He opened his eyes and sat forward. He could hear his own breath and the breath of the stove and the small scratch of a moth at the glass of the lamp. "Who?" he asked. She stared at the wall. The skin along her jaw trembled once and went still. Her left hand slid under the blanket and gripped the edge of the cot. "Men from Larkspur," she said. He listened. The word Larkspur reached him like grit under a tooth. He had not spoken that town's name in months. He looked down at his hands. A drop of lamplight sat in the cup of his palm. He did not move for a long time. The lamp lowered and held steady. The chime outside did not make another sound. In the window, the circle on the glass was more silver than before. He counted again, not out loud. 4 nights. The next morning had a cold edge even with the sun up. June sat propped against the pillow while the steam from the coffee drifted across her face. She held the cup with both hands. Her fingers were thinner than they should be. The cup clinked once against her tooth, and she did not apologize for it. Jonah set a plate with cornbread and honey on the table. He found the small jar at the back of the cupboard where he had been saving it for no one in particular. He cut the bread a square for her, and a smaller one for himself. The knife left a neat groove in the wood. He watched her chew and then stood so he would not stare. Silas came in without knocking. He set his hat on the peg and looked from June to Jonah and back again. His boots carried dust in from the yard. He moved like a man who knew which boards complained and which were quiet. "Fence is holding," Silas said. "North gate needs oil." "I will see it," Jonah said. Silas sniffed the air and found the coffee. He poured a half cup and drank it as if it might run away. His eyes slid to the window. Outside, the sky over the mesa had that high, clear look that makes sound carry farther than it should. June lowered the cup and pressed the rim to her lip to warm the skin there. "You sleep?" Silas asked. "A little," she said. Her voice still tore a bit on the softer words. She kept the blanket over her legs, and the knife he had cleaned sat under the edge of the pillow where she could reach it without lifting her head. Jonah saw that and let it be. He cleaned the pan and set it on the hook. He checked the water bucket and filled it to the mark he had made with a charcoal line. He was careful to do the morning things in order: cloth, water, a small meal. The rhythm steadied him, and it steadied the house. He tied a fresh strip of linen around June's wrist and did not look at the old marks while he did it. "Men from Larkspur," he said, like a man trying on a shirt he had not worn in some time. June looked down at the line on her wrist. She did not answer. Silas put his cup down with care. "You are not taking this to town," he said. Jonah looked at him. "I am." Silas worked his jaw. His hand went to his knee without thinking, then dropped away. "You walk into the saloon and say what? That you found a woman bleeding at your fence, that you plan to keep her because the sky is wide and the fence is yours. They will laugh into your face and then count how many bullets are in their pockets." Jonah folded a towel and set it in the drawer. "They can count." Silas watched him for a long breath. Then he nodded once as if he had expected this answer before he asked the question. He picked up his hat and set it back on his head and turned for the door. June looked up. "If you go, they will see you. They will know where to look." "I live here," Jonah said. "They know where to look." She held his eyes for a heartbeat. The corner of her mouth tightened. Then she pulled the blanket up and leaned back against the wall. The sun worked its way across the floorboard seam by seam. He saddled the bay and buckled his belt and slid the rifle into the scabbard. He did not put on his best shirt, and he did not take off his work gloves. Silas followed him as far as the gate, and then stopped there with one hand on the post, the way a man stands at a grave a moment longer than he needs to. The ride into Larkspur took an hour over flat ground that showed everything and hid nothing. Brush scratched the horse's ribs. A hawk circled and then went away. The town rose out of the heat with the low false shoulders of the saloon and the real square bulk of the feed store and the jail. A dog barked once and decided it was not worth the work. Jonah rode straight to the rail and tied off. He felt the eyes without looking. Men on the porch where the shade held. Women behind glass watching from the seam between curtain and frame. The church bell did not ring. It hardly ever did on a weekday. Sheriff Walt Miller stood near the feed store with his hat tilted forward. He had a pencil behind his ear and a piece of paper in his pocket that might have been official once. He saw Jonah and pushed his shoulders back as to fill the shirt he wore, and then seemed to think better of it. "Morning," Sheriff said. "Morning," Jonah said. "You got business here?" Sheriff asked. "I have words," Jonah said. Sheriff wet his lips. His eyes slid to the saloon door. "Careful with your words." Jonah looked past him. The silver spur swung its doors open at a man's hand. Barrett Sloane stepped onto the porch in a suit the color of dry grass. His boots were clean. He had a square of white cloth in his hand that he used for his face, even though it was not hot in the shade. "Read," Barrett said. He said it like a question and a greeting at the same time. "You do not come to town much, something we can assist with." The porch creaked as men shifted to see. Someone laughed under his breath and hurried to stop laughing when no one joined him. "I found a woman by my fence," Jonah said, "half dead." Barrett's eyes moved a tiny amount. Jonah saw the move and so did Sheriff, though Sheriff looked away quick. Barrett folded the cloth and unfolded it and folded it again. "There are a lot of fences," Barrett said, "and a lot of women with a talent for trouble." "She is not your business," Jonah said. Barrett smiled without putting anything in the smile. "You know what my business is." "Buying cattle," Jonah said. Barrett's hand stilled on the cloth. "And other things depending on the season." "Not people," Jonah said. The word hung like a nail in a wall. The porch went quiet. Sheriff made a small sound with his shoe on the step, and then held still. Barrett blinked the way a lizard blinks. "Careful with your words," he said. He used the sheriff's earlier tone. It sounded different in his mouth. "You paid someone for that woman," Jonah said. He did not raise his voice. He did not move his feet. "Do not come to my gate for her." Barrett laughed once. It was a soft, dry laugh with no air in it. He wiped at the corner of his mouth and looked at the wet patch on his cloth as if it surprised him. "You are a generous man, Reed. Always have been. Took in strays. Gave second chances. It suits you. It makes you slow." Jonah looked at the men on the porch. He knew faces and the names that rode with them. He saw how they watched him and how they watched Barrett to learn how much to risk. He had seen it his whole life and had not found a cure for it. Sheriff stepped down a tread. His hand rested near the notch on his belt where the leather had thinned. "Jonah, let us be reasonable." "I am reasonable," Jonah said. Barrett spread his hands like he was closing a deal. "Bring her. We will check her condition. We will decide what is owed. I will be fair." "No," Jonah said. It was the smallest word in the street. It carried the farthest. It made two men shift their feet without meaning to. The dog that had barked earlier got up and went under a wagon. Barrett did not smile anymore. His lips made a line you could cut paper with. He folded the cloth into a neat square and tucked it into his pocket. "You can test yourself if you like," he said. "You can make a point. Men like making points. Points break." Jonah did not look at the pocket where the cloth had gone. He looked at Barrett's hand. It shook once at the knuckle and then was still. "Stay off my land," Jonah said. He turned away and took the rail rope in his fist. Sheriff moved again like he had found a path. "I cannot help you if you invite trouble," he said. "I did not invite it," Jonah said. He untied the rope and put it in his hand. He rode out without looking back. He felt the porch watching him go. He told himself the wind on his neck was no different than it had been an hour ago. It did not feel different. On the road home, the land opened, and the town sank behind him and lost its edges. The horse settled into a steady walk. Dust rose and fell like breath. A raven crossed low and scolded the day with a harsh sound. Halfway to the ranch he stopped. He did not know why before he did it. He turned in the saddle and looked at the hills to the south. For an instant he saw two riders standing where the ridge ribbed up against the sky. They were still enough to be stones. Then they were gone. He sat a long moment and heard only the sound of the horse pulling at the bit. He touched the rifle stock with the back of his hand and then did not take it out. Back at Broken Mesa, the yard had the late light on it. The pump handle leaned against the wellhead. The trough was full and still. The circle in the water had changed shape with the hour. It was more coin than crescent. He put the handle down and watched the ring quiet. Silas was mending a bridle at the corner of the barn. He had looped old tin cans on a string near the back door of the stall. The string crossed low where a man in a hurry would not see it. "Keeping mice out?" Silas said without being asked. "Good idea," Jonah said. "Ambo seisi ie ibestimei." Silas nodded and coughed and rubbed his chest a little. He squinted at the field as if the grass had a pattern to be read. Inside, June had pulled her hair back with a strip of cloth. The color had come back to her mouth. She had pushed the cot to where the wall met the window so she could lean and still see the yard. Her eyes searched his face and then went softer. "You went," she said. He set his hat on the peg and poured water from the kettle into the pan. He watched the water make a bright skin and then break. "I went," he said. "Did they laugh?" she asked. "Some did," he said. "Did you laugh?" she asked. "No," he said. She held the blanket tight with one hand. "They will not forget you." He picked up the cloth and folded it in half and then in quarters. "They already knew my name." He cleaned the cut on her cheek and worked the rag along the line of it. He dabbed until the blood stopped trying to return. He set the rag in the bowl and the water pinked with the day's work. They ate in the quiet. He had fried the last of the pork, and June ate slowly and did not leave a piece on the tin. The sky outside went from yellow to the color of a bruise. The wind swung the horseshoe chime once and let it settle. When he took the lamp down, June watched the flame shift in the glass. "That sound at noon," she said. "Tin on string." "Mice," he said. She looked at him and then away. "Good idea." He sat in the chair with the leather worn thin at the arm. She lay back and kept her hands where he could see them. He listened for the small scrape of a boot where no boot should be. He heard crickets and a horse moving weight from one hip to the other, and the new soft click of can on can when the wind had reason. He closed his eyes and opened them again. He thought of the two riders he had seen on the ridge and told himself that air has tricks when the light hits it a certain way. The moon rose across the open land. It cleared the low shoulder of the hills and pinned itself above the yard. Not full, not thin. He could feel it on his skin the way he could feel hot iron without touching it. He took the cup from June and set it on the floor beside his boot. She breathed steady for a time, then she spoke. "Sometimes they whistled," she said. "They liked the sound of fear before they could smell it." He did not ask who they were. She had already told him. He did not promise her anything with words he could not carry. He reached over and pulled the blanket higher on her shoulder. The lamp shadow climbed the wall and settled in a corner. Outside, something small moved near the stall, and the cans ticked twice and made a very light sound. He stood and went to the door, and stood with his hand on the latch. The yard lay open and simple under the moon. The corral posts cast neat lines on the dirt. Far off, a coyote yipped and then fell quiet, as if it too was listening. The air thinned after midnight. The heat bled out of the yard, and the boards held a faint chill when Jonah pressed his palm to the door. In the house, the lamp was turned low. June slept without snoring. Her breath made a soft lift under the blanket, and then a pause, and then another lift. He had moved a pallet into the storm cellar and laid a folded coat as a pillow. She had looked at the dark rectangle and the steps that went down and had not argued. He had left the door half open and the lamp on the first riser. It made a shallow bowl of light at the bottom, like a small fire that did not crackle. He checked the latch on the back door and the slide on the window and the nails that held the horseshoe chime. He stepped out. He counted to 3 in his head because it steadied him. The sky over the mesa wore a white coin. Not full, not thin. The coin lit the trough and the rail and the top wire of the fence and the tin cans that Silas had strung low across the stall doorway. Silas waited at the corner of the barn with the rifle that had belonged to his uncle. He had a rag tied around his hand where a thorn had split the skin. He shifted his weight to spare the knee that did not like stopping once it got going. He did not look at Jonah when he spoke. "Wind is right," Silas said, "from the west." "Good," Jonah said. Silas coughed into the bend of his arm and then looked at the ground as if the cough might be lying there. He pointed with his chin toward the bales he had dragged near the corral. They would break a line of sight without looking like a wall. A jug of kerosene sat in the shadow behind them, with the stopper set loose. "Light if we must," Silas said. Jonah nodded. He walked the fence with a slow foot and then crossed the yard and stood at the far side of the house. He did not call this a plan. He did not like how the word felt. He breathed and listened and let his eyes adjust until the yard was not a wash of pale, but a map of shapes he knew by hand. He checked the glass he had raked into the sand in a small patch in front of the stall. He had walked there in leather soles to see if the sound gave itself away. It did. A fine grit grind that was not the sound of clean sand. He let the horses smell his shirt so they would not shy at him. The bay flicked an ear and settled. Inside, June turned in the cot, and the blanket rasped on the coarse sheet. Jonah looked through the window to see her face in the weak lamplight. Her eyes were open. She watched the glow on the stair and kept her hand under the pillow. He took his place by the post that touched the porch. He set the shotgun in the crook of his arm and laid the rifle within reach. He did not sit. He stood with his shoulder to the wood so he could feel any tremor through it. His mouth tasted of metal and old coffee. On the sill, the black line of a moth rested its wings. Time stretched tight, and then sagged, and then pulled tight again. Crickets sawed. A coyote spoke, and then shut up. The chime stayed quiet a long time. Then the cans clicked once. Then nothing. He waited and told himself that mice were not the only animals that moved at night. The cans clicked again. 2 short taps. Then the dry rasp of something that was not a mouse followed slow and careful. A boot on glass. He lifted the shotgun to his shoulder. He did not swing it yet. Across the yard, a shadow separated itself from the line of the fence. It slid and then paused and then slid again. Then another in the other direction. He did not look for a third. Men who came to take took numbers that made them feel sure. He kept his eyes on the shadow that moved toward the stall and on the dark crease by the corral where a man would run if he got spooked. "Easy," Silas said from the barn corner. Jonah could not see his mouth when he said it. He heard the smooth clink of the bolt he knew that rifle carried and the soft set of boot on dirt. The first man reached the patch of sand with the glass. He did not know it. He learned it with the next step. The grain bit. He bit back a sound and took the weight different on his foot to save the noise he had just made. That adjustment made a tin can roll and kiss the next can. The metal kisses went down the line in a quick chain. Jonah stepped out of the shadow and fired the first shot over the man's head. The sound blew the thin air wide and then snapped it back. The horse in the corral jumped and then stilled. The man ducked and turned. Silas answered from the barn with a shot that slapped splinters from the stall door and made the second shadow fold and drop behind the trough. The third man broke for the fence and then thought better of a straight run and cut for the dark under the eave. "Set it," Silas called. Jonah moved low and fast. He pulled the stopper and soaked the row of hay with a pull of his arm that babied the shoulder he had hurt in a fall years back. The smell of kerosene climbed. He struck the match on the rough post and cupped it with his hand and touched it to the wet straw. Fire does not always roar when it starts. This one breathed. It took into itself and then gave out a fast, bright lane that ran the edge of the bales. Light arrived where shadow had been. The yard turned to morning in a strip, and the strip widened. Jonah saw a jaw and a hat and a pair of eyes and the flash of a knife blade. He swung the shotgun to the place where the eyes were and squeezed. The blast kicked. The man stumbled and went to both knees with his hands out as if to catch himself on air. Silas dropped the second shooter when he rolled to change angle. The old man did not waste rounds. He had learned the price of wasted things. He shot once, and then he waited, and then he moved, and then he shot again. The third man put a slug into the plank at Jonah's hip, and a line of splinters cut his shirt and went down his side with the sting of nettles. He went down to a knee because the knee knew how to be close to the ground. He took a breath, the way he would before lifting a post, and then he fired into the dark under the eave. He did not see if he hit. He saw the shape jerk and hear a curse that rose like a bark. The fire reached the old rake handle and made it pop. Sparks floated and died on the hard dirt. Heat pushed at Jonah's face and made his eyes water. He blinked them clear and saw the man at the trough drag himself with his elbows and leave a wet black line behind where he went. The line shone like oil in the light, and then became what it was. "Back," Silas called. The word was flat and carried across the light and the heat. Jonah stepped back to clear the blast of the next shot. Silas put that shot into the leg of the man who was running for the fence. The man pitched forward and slid on his hands and left skin on the ground. He set his head down and did not move. The smell of hair burning rides in under other smells. It found Jonah and made his stomach turn. He worked the action and checked his shells and counted what he had left against how many men his eyes told him could still fire. He did not speak. He kept the chant in his head. 1, 2, 3. From the dark at the corner of the house, an arm flung something low and fast. It clattered into the bales and died. He waited for the blast that did not come. The thrower had tried for a bottle with flame and sent a plain bottle without. Fear bends hands. "Help me," a voice on the ground said. It was the voice of a young man who had expected to be older all his life. Jonah moved toward the sound, and then stopped when June spoke from the door behind him. "Do not," she said. Her voice did not rise. It crossed the space between them and reached him stronger than the fire did. He looked and saw the cellar door behind her shoulder and the pale bowl of light on the stairs. Her hair was loose on one side from where she had slept. Her eyes were the sort that did not believe and still asked. He pointed the gun at the yard and not at the man, and he did not go to him. He held where he was and watched for the movement that meant a weapon and not a plea. The third man fired into the fire in panic, and the shot went wild. It smacked the pump handle and made the handle jump. The trough took the ricochet and the water jumped, and a slice of the moon in the water jumped with it, and then laid down again. The image went from coin to broken circle, and then settled back into coin. "Out," Silas called. He had moved to the far corner and had a better view down the fence line. 2 riders, they bolt. Jonah did not chase. He stood and watched their backs get small across the scrub. He heard one call to the other to leave the fallen, and the other yell a word that sounded like cousin, and then both of them went quiet again. The yard went still except for the fire and the sound of the wounded man breathing through the gap in his teeth. The barn cast hard shadows that reached like fingers and then let go. Jonah went to the jug and kicked dirt in a line to check the spread. He took the shovel and pushed the glowing straw inward so the flame would eat itself. Behind him, June put her hand flat on the door frame. He could feel the presence of that hand without turning. He stamped the edge of a spark that had jumped and then looked toward the barn, where Silas had first taken his post. "Silas," he said. No answer. He moved quick. He kept the shotgun across his chest and crossed the yard with the shovel clanking lightly against his leg where he had hooked it with his free hand. He rounded the corner of the barn and looked for the outline of the man and the rifle barrel, and did not find either. "Silas," he said again. He saw the place where the old man had been. The dirt there had a print where a knee had been, and a smear where a boot had pushed off. The rifle leaned against the wall, with its butt in the dust and the barrel pointing slightly down. That was not where Silas would have set it. The door to the tack room stood open a hand width. Jonah put his shoulder to the post and peered into the dark of the room. The smell in there was leather and oil, and a trace of mice and a new edge that had nothing to do with any of those. He stepped inside, and the dirt under his boot whispered. On the floor, a small square of white cloth lay folded twice and then dropped. He bent and picked it up. It was no rag he recognized from the barn. It was the kind a man at a saloon would carry to touch his face. He held the cloth and listened for breath that was not his. He heard the fire sink. He heard the pump drip. He heard the cans tap once and then still. He heard a sound in his chest he had not heard since the day his wife had taken hers and left it to him. "Silas," he said a third time. The tack room held the dark close. Jonah stood until his eyes caught the shape that was not a saddle and not a bale. Silas lay half-turned, one hand under his ribs, the other crooked near his neck, as if to tuck in a shirt that had slipped. His hat had rolled to the wall. The rifle was where someone else had set it. A black wet spread under his back and found its way into the cracks of the plank floor. Jonah knelt. He felt for breath at the old man's mouth and found only the room's cold. He closed the eyes with his thumb and forefinger. They obeyed. He took his coat off and laid it over the chest that had worked too hard for too long. He folded the edge under the jaw so it would not show the open place at the throat. Outside, the wounded man tried again to make his voice sound like a person's. The attempt fell apart and left raw noise in the yard. Jonah stood and wiped his hands on his jeans and walked back into the light. June had not moved from the doorframe. Her knuckles were white on the wood. The lamp on the stair burned steady and threw an oval of light on the lower step. It looked like a pond framed in dirt. He went past her without speaking and crossed to the man at the trough. The boy's face had grown old in an hour. Blood darkened the boards under him, and the wet had found the dust and made it cake. His hat lay against the trough post like a head without a body. "Water," the boy said. It came out as a scrape. Jonah filled the tin cup and set it near without bringing it to the lips. The boy reached with a shaking hand and knocked it into the dirt. Jonah did not pick it up. He squatted and watched the chest go up and down. He waited for a hand to move toward a gun or the belt or a boot. No hand moved. Silas's rifle sounded loud inside Jonah's head where it would live now. He stood and looked to the south ridge. The two riders were smudges against the pale sky, and then grass hid them. The fire had done what it needed to do. It had eaten a path, and then it had lost interest. The last tongues licked black straw for nothing. Jonah shoveled dirt over the orange places. He pressed the back of the shovel into a glow, and lifted and pressed again. June stepped back from the door and went to the basin. She filled it with the last hot water, and set a cloth in it, and wrung it, and held the cloth a moment in both hands. She set the cloth on the table and sat. She pressed her palms flat to her knees to keep them still. There was no sound on the road yet. The night opened, then fell in, then opened again. At last the east felt lighter even before a color showed. Wind got under the chime and made it click once. The horse in the corral shifted weight and lifted a hind leg and set it down. Jonah took a sheet from the trunk and went back to the tack room. He laid it over Silas's face and the top of his chest, so the dust would not land where it had no right to land. He set the hat at the man's side. He stood a moment with the coat still warm from living and then stepped away. By dawn, the yard looked like the picture of something, after the way a photographer might have wanted it. Smoke faint in the air, a broken piece of bottle near a burned spot, a circle of water in the trough that pretended nothing had happened to it in the night. June's shadow on the floor like a page corner turned down to remember a line. Hoofbeats came thin from the road, and then thick when they hit the packed yard. Sheriff Miller rode in with a deputy whose name Jonah could not bring to mind. The deputy looked younger than the man in the dust by the trough. Sheriff dismounted slow, as if the ground might judge him for the speed he used. He took his hat off and held it by the brim. He looked at the boy on the ground, and then at the bales and the scorch and the cans strung on string at the stall door. "Fire catch," Sheriff said. His voice did not reach far. "Lantern tipped," Jonah said. Sheriff nodded. He did not look at Jonah when he did. The deputy went to the trough and bent, and then swore under his breath, and then stood. He did not touch the body. "Who shot first?" Sheriff asked. "Thunder," Jonah said. That pulled a short breath from the deputy that might have been a laugh before it died. Sheriff brushed a finger along the brim of his hat. His eyes found the tack room door open the width of a hand. "Someone hurt in there?" he asked. "Mine," Jonah said. Sheriff took a step and then stopped. He did not ask to see. He looked instead at the line of prints near the sand with the glass and at the marks where a man had tried to run with a hurt leg. He followed the trail with his eyes to where it blurred into the common dust. "You know who," Sheriff said. "No," Jonah said. He did know the shape of a white cloth folded twice and then dropped. He kept it in his pocket. He felt it there now against the fabric. He could smell the small clean in it that did not belong in a barn. Sheriff put his hat back on. "You want me to send men for digging?" he asked. "I have a shovel," Jonah said. Sheriff watched him for a moment. He was not a cruel man. He had learned how far his hands could reach, and then he had learned to keep them there. He nodded once and turned. He did not tell the deputy to help. He did not tell him not to. The deputy chose not to. They lifted the boy at the trough and carried him to the wagon. The boy's arm swung and then fell, and the deputy set it back. The wheel creaked. Sheriff climbed up, settled the reins, and shook them. At the gate he stopped and looked back. "Jonah," he said, "I did not see a fire." "I did not see it either," Jonah said. The wagon pulled out. Dust from the wheels drew a line along the yard and faded. Jonah stood with the shovel in his hand and looked at the rectangle of ground by the cottonwood where the shade lasted longest. He set the blade to the earth and pushed with his boot. The soil there held moisture deep down, and the first thrust brought up the smell of worms and old leaves and the sweet that lives under dust. He did the work without counting. He stopped when the depth felt right. He brought Silas out wrapped in the coat and sheet. He set the hat on his chest. He did not say words over him. He pressed the first shovel of dirt and then the next. June stood at the edge and kept her hands inside the sleeves of his extra shirt. When the last of the white was gone, she knelt and laid the horseshoe chime on the dirt as if to weigh it down. The little ring swung and made a sound that did not carry far. They ate cold bread and drank water that had lost its chill in the bucket. The taste felt like iron on the tongue. June's eyes stayed on the window more than on her food. Jonah washed the bowl and set it to dry and wiped the counter and wiped it again. He valued the feel of the cloth moving over a clean board. It made his hand understand there were still things that answered to a touch. He went out to the pump and worked the handle until the trough overflowed and washed a line of ash into the yard. The surface settled and caught the sky. The moon had gone, but a pale smear still hung high, and the water held it in a broken circle that smoothed and finally took in the light without a mark. Back inside, he found June sitting straight with the blanket around her shoulders and the knife back under the pillow. Her hair was tied away from her face. The bruise at her temple had faded along the outer edges and gone the color of old plums. "You breathe easier when the pump runs," she said. "It gives the yard a sound I know," he said. She watched him. He took a breath to speak and then let it go. He looked down at his hands. One knuckle had a split in it from the shovel handle. He blew on it as if that would close it. "I have a place," he said. "North, water and rock, and not many eyes." June did not answer. She shifted the blanket and put her bare feet on the floor and set them there a moment. She looked at the floor as if testing if it would take her weight. She stood. She swayed. She did not fall. He found a canvas sack and filled it without thinking about making a list. The things felt right in the hand, or they did not. He took the tin cup that had dented, and the folded sheet, and the kettle that had lost its handle a winter back. He took the horseshoe chime from the fresh dirt and tied it to the saddlebag so it would move with them and speak if the wind cared to speak to it. June rolled the blanket that had traveled with her this far and tied it with a strip of cloth cut from the old shirt he had been meaning to mend. He walked the rooms and set what needed setting. He banked the stove and closed the windows and left the latch loose so the house would not split if the wind took a mood. He looked once at the chair with the leather worn thin and did not sit in it. June stood at the door with the bag over one shoulder. The knife was at her waist under the shirt. She had tied her hair with a scrap of red that had been in the bottom of a drawer for years. It made her eyes look darker. They led the horses out. The bay pushed a soft breath from its nose and flicked an ear at the chime. Jonah tightened the cinch and checked the girth, and did it again without meaning to. He looked over the yard. He saw the mark where the bottle had hit and not broken, and where a bullet had taken a chew from the pump handle. He saw where he had dug, and he saw the place where the ash had turned the dirt a different color. June lifted the canteen and drank, and then lifted it to him. He drank and handed it back. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and looked toward the north, where the land rose and then fell into a run of rock. He swung into the saddle and reached down. She put her foot in the stirrup and took his forearm and let him pull. She settled behind and found the place her hands fit on the horn, and then moved one to his belt instead. The chime gave a small sound at the first step, and then another. It was not a warning. It sounded like a note struck to check if an instrument is tuned. They rode out under the pale sky. The sun pushed a line of light along the ridges and made the scrub cast long blue that ran away from them. At the gate, Jonah stopped and looked back once. The house stood with its door closed and its windows looking like eyes set to rest. The trough held the sky and the slice of pale day. He touched the brim of his hat without thinking of why and then turned the horse north. The road met them and opened. The air smelled of dust and sage and the new heat that was on its way. They rode until afternoon flattened the land into light and heat. The ground tilted and folded, broke into low shelves of rock, then fell away to a cut where water ran all year. The river moved with a steady muscle. Cottonwoods leaned in their leaves, flashing silver when the wind turned them. The air down in the cut was cooler, and the shade had a sweetness that did not belong to the mesa. Jonah slid from the saddle and held the bay while June climbed down. She stood with her hands on her hips and breathed like a person who had just climbed out of a long ditch. The chime on the saddlebag rang once when the horse shook and then hung still. They led the horses along a narrow trail that worked down between red stone and cedar. The path gave into a small shelf under a wall of rock. A trickle joined the river there, clean and cold, slipping out of black shadow. Juniper berries crushed under a boot and let out a resin smell that sat on the back of the tongue. June went to her knees at the edge and cupped water. She carried it to her face and pressed it to her skin and hissed between her teeth. She held the second handful to her throat, where the crescent scar lived, and let it run down. The light on the surface broke and repaired, as if it knew how to do nothing else. "This is it," Jonah said. He had set his palm to the rock while he spoke. He always touched new ground that way to let it answer. They picketed the horses in a pocket of grass and found an old fire ring where stones had been darkened by someone else's nights. Jonah stacked kindling and split cedar, then set a match to it. The flame took with a small sound. The smoke rose straight, then drifted under the cliff and held there. June sat on a flat rock with the damp still on her hair. She watched the smoke draw a line against the stone. They worked without saying what should be done next. He cleared a space with a short-handled hoe that lived tied under the saddle. She shook out the blanket and laid it where the ground was most even. He took the chime from the saddlebag, held it a moment in his palm, then tied it to a notch in the overhang where a bit of wind passed, even when the day did not feel like moving. They ate from the bag, bread torn in fingers, a little pork that tasted of smoke and salt, water from the river. June's eyes followed the current, as if her thoughts could use it to carry weight. He let her do that. He did not ask what went with the water and what stayed. The work of living took the next day and most of the one after. He cut willow for stakes and ran a line to a juniper. He set a shelter so rain would know where to go. He dug a shallow sump so water would not puddle where they slept. He stacked stones for a better pit and found a piece of flat rock to serve as a shelf. June sorted the packs and made 3 little piles without thinking that the number had a meaning. Food, cloth, tools. At noon she washed the tin cup and set it on the rock to catch light. In the evening she brought the chime inside the lean and hung it where the sound would be close. He rose with the sun and walked to the river and splashed his face and neck. He said the count in his head and laughed once at himself for needing the number at all. In the cool, he took the bay higher and found a way out if water went mean. In the heat, he sat where the shade reached and pared down sticks for pegs, shaved them clean so they would take a line. She pulled thread through a seam in her dress where the shoulder had given and bit off the end with a soft click of teeth. When she pricked her finger, she lifted it and smiled at the small dot like a person meeting an old acquaintance. They fell into a pattern. Morning held water and cloth and breath. At noon, there were the simple things that carry a day. A small meal, a kettle talking in its own language, the sound of a knife on a board. Evening meant the lamp and the slow burn of juniper in the pit. The chime gave a note when the wind came down the cut. The note lived in the lean and on their sleeves and in the edges of sleep. June's steps grew sure. She walked to the river with a measured stride that did not waste a part of the foot. She leaned over the horse and pulled a burr from the mane with 2 fingers and a patience that kept the hair. She braided a rope of grass as if her hands remembered the motion from somewhere else and wanted to practice it in this place. On the 3rd morning, Jonah carried a small frame of poles to the water. He had lashed them together with rawhide. He set the frame near the current and wove willow through it until it was a mat. He weighted it with stones and set the tin cup at the edge so it could fill and empty and fill again. June watched the cup take the flow in and let it go. He saw her throat move the way a person moves when listening to a long piece of music. Silas had taken quiet with him and left quiet as a friend. In the afternoons, Jonah heard the old man cough in the back of the mind and then felt the space where that sound used to be. He would reach for the rifle to clean it and then remember it lived at the ranch. He would set his hand on the shovel handle and remember where the wood had struck his knuckle. He would stand with the chime in his palm and let it speak the small note it knew. The note said a thing without asking to be answered. June did not avoid sleep. When it came hard and clean. The dreams left little trace on her face. Waking left more. She woke and checked the door and the sky and then pulled one hand across her mouth and let it fall to her lap. At night, she would sit with her back to the rock and look at the place where the cliff met the stars. She would not look long, enough to know the sky was still on duty. They set stones for a wall when the light shifted to fall. The days had thinned and the heat had softened at the edges. He cut small timbers from a stand of straight young trees up the draw. He trimmed them and carried them on his shoulder. She carried lengths of rope and a bag with nails and the small hammer that used to live in the drawer by the stove. It had a mark on the handle where he had once missed and struck it with a larger hammer years back, and the bruise had never left. They raised the walls in a slow, careful way. He held while she set the nail, and she struck true, and the sound went into the rock and came back gentled. The roof they made with brush and a canvas that had patched a wagon long ago. Rain would find a way through on hard nights, but the worst of it would slide and drop to the ground where it belonged. They brought the cot in and the chair with the thin leather and set them near the stone wall. The chair looked smaller in this new room. He touched the worn arm and then let it alone. June set a bowl on the shelf of rock. She placed the cup beside it. She put a strip of red cloth along the edge of the shelf, without looking to see if it lay straight. A woman and a child reached them one late afternoon. The woman stood at the edge of the shelf and did not cross into the shade. The child pressed a face into the woman's skirt. The woman's shoes were good shoes that had walked too far. Dust made them the same color as everything else. June stood. She did not ask a question first. She took the cup to the river and filled it and brought it back and placed it in the woman's hand and curled the fingers around it. The woman drank. The child peered at the water, as if it might boast about how it had come so far while staying in one piece. Jonah moved to the side so the doorway would not feel like a frame for someone to be judged in. The woman sat only after the child sat. She did not look at June's face. She looked at the chime when it lifted and fell. She kept one hand on the crown of the child's head and counted something with her thumb on the scalp. He could not tell what. He did not ask. June ladled soup into a bowl and pushed the bowl until it touched the woman's fingers. The woman ate. The child ate when the spoon found the small mouth. The chime gave one sound when the wind found it. They slept that night with another breathing in the lean. It did not change the shape of the room. It changed the rhythm. The fire burned lower because there were more bodies to keep the air lived in. He woke once and checked the line where he had staked the horses. He checked the door. He checked the lamp. June breathed even. The woman sighed and did not sound like she would cry. The child made a small sound, not pain, the sound a throat makes to remind the world it is working. By the first frost, the river ran a little quicker. Ice formed in a thin lace at the edges, then broke at noon. June cracked it with a stick and watched it float like clear leaves. The wind carried a clean blade through the cut and sharpened the chime to a brighter note. Jonah set a stack of wood under the lean and admired it in a quiet way. He liked a row that kept its promise. They kept the count because it felt right, not because it was needed to live at all. Water in the morning hot if the fire was ready. A small meal at noon that did not ask much from the stomach. At night, the blanket still warm from the sun for a moment, before it gave that back and a clean cloth if sweat had made the skin stick. He made the counts in his head at first, and then found he could leave them and still hit the marks. Snow came once in a thin veil and took itself back quick. The scar at June's neck faded to a pale line. When she brushed her hair at the river, the line hid and then showed and then hid again. On some days, Jonah did not notice it. On others, he saw it and felt his tongue push the roof of his mouth as if tasting a small bitterness. When that happened, he went to the water and washed his hands and let the cold talk him down to a steady. The woman and the child moved on. A man with a torn jacket came through not long after. He stopped at the edge and touched his hat to the rock instead of to them. He warmed his hands and fixed a notch in his boot and left. A pair of sisters arrived when the cottonwoods went gold. They carried a basket that had held peaches once. The basket smelled like summer, even with nothing in it. The sisters stayed 3 nights. They left the basket. June used it for cloth, and later for beans, and later for nothing in particular. It still smelled a little like fruit. They built a door that shut with a stick. They did not lock it. The stick kept the wind from playing inside. The inside did not hold much. A bed, a chair, a shelf, a bowl, a cup, a pot. The chime at the lintel gave a small sound when a body moved through and brushed air into it. It became a greeting. On an evening with the light coming thin and clear, Jonah took the chime down and rubbed the rust from its curve. June sat with her feet under her and mended the heel of a sock so the stitch would not raise a blister. He held the chime out and she tied a new strip of cloth where the old twine had given. She lifted it and listened before she hung it. It gave a soft note with a little lower sound underneath, like a second voice agreeing. They ate, then washed the bowls and tipped them to dry at an angle. He filled the kettle, set it near the coals, and listened to the small sounds it made. June took the cup and placed it by the door where a person might reach it first without crossing the room. She set a folded cloth beside it. She put her palm to the smooth wood of the door and left it there a moment. Night came up from the river. The cliff face held the last of the day like a mirror and then let it go. The horses snorted once and settled. The chime answered and then rested. Jonah sat back and watched the light move on the floor and stop. June lay down and closed her eyes. Her breath found its place. He pulled the blanket to her shoulder and tucked it there, and let his hand stay for one count. Then he sat. He listened. Water worked the stones in the dark and did not announce that it was doing it. He took a full breath and let it out and felt it leave him in 3 parts. One for morning, one for noon, one for night. The cup by the door caught a thin moon and made its own small circle. The room held quiet the way a hand holds a coin. The quiet stayed. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.